Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome to this episode. If you're joining in for the very first time, welcome. The goal of this show is twofold. One, if you're a technical operator and you're part of the team that is involved in the day-to-day operations of a SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solution. Maybe you're a database administrator or a systems administrator or systems engineer, or maybe you're a developer who happens to know how to spell SQL and you were now given the responsibility to take care of your SQL Server databases. And whether you're in that stage where you're evaluating a high availability and or disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server databases, or maybe you already have one, but somebody built it, a vendor, and that's exactly what we are going to be talking about in this episode. Maybe a vendor built it and then they handed it off to you and you don't know exactly how everything works because they did not do a proper handoff. Or maybe you already have an existing HADR solution, but it's constantly giving you some issues and you still don't know how to resolve those issues and you don't know where to start. Well, this episode is for you. And I did say it's twofold, right? So the second piece of this is for decision makers, whether you're the VP of engineering, the CIO, team lead for a team of database administrators or a database team, and you're making decisions on what kind of high availability and or disaster recovery solution you need for your databases, or maybe your team is not ready yet. Again, as somebody built the high availability solution, they did not do a proper handoff, but now your team is responsible for taking care of it, but they're not ready for the challenge. And not because they're not skilled, it's just that sometimes managing day-to-day operations is a little bit of a struggle, especially, of course, when you're constantly fighting fires and always looking at making sure you're keeping the lights on. I did mention that this episode is part of a series that I call Vendor Dilemma, right? When I talk about a Vendor Dilemma series, I wanted to focus on common recommendations from your vendors. And when I mean vendors, for one, Microsoft is a vendor. In fact, Microsoft is the primary vendor for the SQL Server platform, the database platform, and they're a vendor. And whether you're simply building a database for your custom built application, they would recommend a high availability and or disaster recovery solution for you. Or maybe you're using a Microsoft product like Dynamics, SharePoint, and those products use a SQL Server as a backend database. They would also have recommendations for you, right? So Microsoft is one, VMware is one. When you're running your SQL Server databases on virtual machines running on VMware, they do have recommendations on how to do that, and also how you can implement high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, both with VMware together with SQL Server or just SQL Server in and of itself. Vendors also are your third-party application vendors, whether you're dealing with an ERP system, a CRM system, some custom off-the-shelf software that you bought from a development company, and they also have recommendations on running their apps with SQL Server as a backend database. So that's one. Managed services provider or consulting companies where they built the solution, or even systems integrators where they built a solution for you and they make recommendations on your SQL Server databases, both on the optimization part, maybe improving how your SQL Server databases function, including, of course, the main theme of this entire show, high availability and disaster recovery. And the reason I wanted to really get into this vendor dilemma series is because I have been talking to a lot of customers where they're implementing a solution, or they've already implemented a solution for their SQL Server databases that were from their vendors. Their vendors made a recommendation, and so now they had to do it, or they've already done it, and now they're stuck with some issues based on what they implemented. And this week's episode on vendor dilemma, I wanted to call this the dark side of vendor recommendations. Have you ever had the cases where you asked your vendors, what about our SQL Server databases? What about high availability? And all of a sudden, they would flat out just make recommendations, implement always on availability groups. That's it. Okay. Again, whether it's Microsoft, third party, any type of vendor, flat out they would recommend always on availability groups, and without even asking questions, it's just kind of like a default recommendation. A couple of reasons why vendors recommend always on high availability groups as the default for high availability solutions for your SQL Server databases. Well, for one, it's Microsoft's recommendation, right? And I remember a quote from a good friend of mine who worked as, used to be a CTO, and they would bring consulting companies in, primarily IBM. And when I asked him, so why did you bring IBM as your consulting partner? And it's interesting because his response brings back all of the other technical professionals who are in decision-making roles who have gone before him like decades ago and come up with the same solution. Like nobody ever got fired for bringing in IBM. Whether the recommendations made sense or not, they would still take it because it's IBM, right? And this is where, like I said, I want to talk about the dark side of vendor recommendations, because taking in vendor recommendations without evaluating whether or not those recommendations made sense have a negative side effect, okay? Both on the technical side as well as the people and the process side, and that's what I want to talk about in this episode. Make sure you have your pen and paper ready, take notes. The first thing about the dark side of vendor recommendations when it comes to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions is over-engineering versus business requirement, like over-engineering and versus business requirements. Like I said, you may have heard a vendor, or you may have had a vendor directly just made recommendations about, go ahead, deploy always on availability groups for your SQL Server databases, without even asking, so what are your business requirements when it comes to high availability? I mean, they haven't even asked the question about what your recovery point objective, your recovery time objectives, and your service level agreements. They're, again, kind of like the default response to your question. So what about our SQL Server databases high availability? It's, I don't want to say it's a canned response, but because maybe it's something that they have been doing internally, something that they have been recommending to a lot of their customers. So even without asking the right kind of questions to further evaluate whether or not the recommendations made sense, they're just going to make those recommendations. Like I said, I've heard so many vendors immediately recommend always on availability groups without even asking customers back. I think I shared a tweet or a post on LinkedIn a couple months ago where I said, one way to know whether your technical professional, whether engineers, internal staff, consultants, one way to know the depth of their expertise is the way they respond to a question. If they immediately respond to a question with a straight answer, know for a fact that their depth and level of expertise is kind of like shallow. It's like they always have a direct answer to a question, versus someone who's had depth in their level of expertise. Your question will be a question will be the proper response to your question. And you might be wondering, wait a second, I asked the question, why are you asking me back? Well, because they need context. And in this case, the context is business requirement. Just because you ask for a high availability solution doesn't mean always on available group is the answer. They need to know, as the vendor, they need to ask further questions about, okay, so this is your ERP system. I'll use ERP as an example. This is your ERP system. There are about 100 to 1,000 users. Your, normal business operation is between North American time zone, between, let's say, 8 in the morning Eastern to 7 p.m. Pacific. But if they're not even asking those kinds of questions, like what's the impact to the business when this platform becomes unavailable, then they're simply making recommendations based on the technical aspect versus business requirement. And if you've been following some of the episodes of this show for quite a while, I don't lightly recommend always on availability groups because of its complexity. And sometimes you don't even need it. Okay, so ask the question, is this going to address our business requirement, or is this simply just over engineering for a solution that we might not need? Okay, so over engineering versus business requirement, again, typical case that I've seen where somebody would immediately recommend always on availability groups and not asking a follow-up question. Okay, so make sure that when a vendor makes recommendations on the SQL Server high availability solution, it really is meeting your business requirement rather than simply just for the heck of it, right? And I've even seen cases where the vendor would recommend always on available groups. I'll use that as an example. They'll bring in a technical specialist, and they haven't even done that particular solution. Maybe the technical specialist wanted to put it in his resume and claim that, hey, I've done this solution, and once I've implemented it in production, I can claim it as experience and put it in my resume. Okay, ask. Okay, other than again simply just jumping into, well, let's implement that solution. Make sure that it actually meets your business requirements. So that's the first one. There's this the dark side of over-engineering on a solution that may or may not meet your business requirement. That's the first one. The second one is all about ownership and accountability. Okay, the vendor is making recommendations on a high availability solution, but what happens after production go live, after everybody cuts over to production? Are they going to be taking over as part of day-to-day operations, meaning the monitoring, the issue resolution, the escalation? Are they going to be doing that? Okay, and who is going to be responsible for it? Especially when you're dealing with siloed teams, meaning segregation of duties, where the database team will only take care of SQL Server, and then the sysadmin team will be taking care of the server, the infrastructure. Oh, by the way, the failover cluster, the networking, the storage. How will the vendor come in that case? Will they be taking over and take ownership of the day-to-day operations. Again, who is going to be taking care of monitoring? Who is going to be responding when a ticket comes in? Oh, and by the way, how are we classifying those tickets? Going back to the previous point, if you have so many moving parts, and now I have to make sure that the ticket or the alert that got raised ends up in the proper queue to the corresponding team, right? For instance, if your databases went offline, is it going to be the database team taking care of it? How is the database team going to respond? Or is it going to be the vendor? And if it is the vendor taking care of it, do they have full access to the entire infrastructure from the ground up? Meaning, do they have access to the SQL Server instance? Do they have sysadmin privileges to the SQL Server instance? Do they have access to the storage where the databases are stored? Do they have access to the failover cluster? Are they local administrators on the machines running the failover cluster? Do they have permissions to poke around the network? And this is, again, the ownership of this in large organizations, in most cases, because of segregation of duties, one team cannot even access resources managed by a different team. So how will a vendor take ownership of that? This is beyond just them taking ownership. It's all about processes and making sure that you're following requirements and workflows and compliance requirements as well. Okay, so again, ownership and accountability. Who is taking ownership? Who is accountable? And you have to include that in your workflow. Okay, was one case that I worked on a couple of years ago where their original design was more of a stretched cluster, and the vendor made recommendations mainly because of the fact that their stretched cluster was causing a lot of issues when it comes to the storage. And so the vendor made recommendations on, let's just implement always on availability groups. They deploy the always on availability groups across multiple data centers. And then a couple of months later, they've been working really well. The entire platform was stable and reliable, but then just like anything else, something is bound to break. It's just human nature. It's just the nature of everything, right? They all got on a conference call from the hardware vendor, the storage vendor, and this particular vendor who made recommendations to use always on availability groups. During the troubleshooting call, everybody was pointing fingers. No, it's the storage problem. The storage engineer would say, no, based on the logs, it's SQL Server's problem. And the engineer on call, I forgot if it was the network guy. Again, it's pointing fingers. And the moment that an outage happens is the minute that the clock starts counting towards your recovery point, recovery time, and your objectives and your SLA. So without proper ownership and accountability, you could end up, and I'm not saying you will, okay? Because again, it's all about setting the right expectations, but you're bound to end up in a situation where every single vendor will be pointing fingers. It's not our fault, it's your fault. Or the storage vendors would say, no, it's not our fault, it's your fault. Somebody was, and sometimes whenever I come in some of these troubleshooting exercises where I get brought in as an external vendor, sometimes my job is not even to fix the problem, it's just to get everybody on the same page and stop the finger pointing and get back into achieving the goal, which in this case, bring the databases back online. Okay, so who owns it? Who's accountable to it? Because this becomes a bigger problem when issues happen. We're not even talking about main outages. We're referring to who gets the alerts when you're setting up your monitoring tool, who responds to the tickets that those alerts created? How are they going to get escalated? Is it the vendor's responsibility? Is it your team's responsibility? How are you going to make sure that the workflow from raising an issue to resolution is handled properly when the vendor makes those recommendations? Okay, so again, ownership and accountability. We talked about the first one, which is over-engineering versus business requirements, making sure that you are meeting business requirements and not just over-engineering for the sake of technology. Okay, the second one is ownership and accountability. Who is taking ownership of not just the care and feeding, but the proper process from monitoring to issue escalation to resolution? And then the third one is risk analysis and mitigation. Now, for one, high availability solution is meant to mitigate risks like data loss and downtime. Those are risks, and that's one of the reasons why you want to implement a high availability solution. But your high availability solution also comes with its own risk. Say, for instance, if a vendor implemented it and nobody on your team knows how to manage it, the risk is how long will the issue resolution take? Will that meet your recovery time objective? Meaning, from the time the issue happened to resolution, is it going to meet your recovery time objective if nobody on the team knows how the technology works? That's a risk. But who's taking care of that? Who's taking care of analyzing that risk? Is it the vendor or is it you? And who is going to mitigate that risk? Okay, again, could be that the vendor can mitigate that risk by taking ownership and accountability of the care and feeding. Meaning you're literally hands off to the high availability solution and handing it off to the vendor. But just make sure that the vendor can, again, properly follow proper workflow, proper escalation procedure, proper response to an alert getting raised, an incident creating a ticket, to issue resolution. Okay. Part of implementing an always-on availability solution or any type of high availability solution is, again, the risk of making sure the team, internal or external, has the capabilities. Okay, one customer that I worked with a couple of months ago, a vendor made recommendations on implementing an always-on availability solution. They even came in. They implemented the always-on availability solution, and everybody was happy. Okay, but they also took ownership. Okay, they took ownership, meaning every ticket will be sent to their queue. They have full access to not just the SQL Server instance, not just the boxes, meaning the Windows Server operating systems, but because these are VMs, they also have access to the VMware infrastructure. Well and good, right? However, the vendor, they only know how to build the solution. They don't know how to troubleshoot issues when an issue happens or when an issue suddenly out of nowhere took an entire database server offline, which happened in this particular case. The vendor was supposed to get the alert. They logged in, they started looking at the databases, and it took them like 4 hours before they can bring the databases online. That's primarily because the Windows Server failover cluster is offline, cluster lost quorum, and because of that, they couldn't bring the cluster online. It took them a couple of hours to bring the cluster online, but then because they are not aware of which one was the primary replica prior to the cluster losing quorum, took them a while to figure out what the primary replica was prior to the outage, and it took them a couple more hours to bring the databases online by bringing the AG online. Again, 4 hours. If the vendor built it, you kind of assume that they also can support it and troubleshoot issues and resolve those issues as quickly as they possibly can. Because for one, this is a high availability solution, which means it should be highly available. And because it is highly available, there's certain expectations on how fast the issue resolution should be. In fact, a couple of hours was unacceptable for them. But the vendor took a couple of hours to even bring the databases back online. So again, a part of that is risk analysis and mitigation. You have to analyze the risk. You have to mitigate the risk. Now, if you don't have means to mitigate those risks, you need to find either a different vendor, a different team who can take care of that. But how do you validate whether or not they have proper experience on how to mitigate those risks? Okay, sure, you have to constantly ask. You have to vet those vendors. Ask them, have you done this before? Can we talk to some of your customers? It's part of the vendor vetting process as well. And this is part of the dark side of just taking in vendor recommendations when it comes to complex technology like always-on availability groups, because you're looking at and making sure that a high availability solution meets the business requirements. Okay, it is clear who is taking on ownership and accountability, and the risks are properly analyzed and properly mitigated. Otherwise, the vendor is making recommendations. You take on the complexity, the full responsibility, accountability, and ownership, not realizing that the lack of skills of your team or the lack of experience of the team is in and of itself a risk. Now you have to mitigate. Okay, and part of that is really just being very, very meticulous about the process of vetting vendor recommendations, because it is going to be your databases that will be at risk. And at the end of the day, all of the vendor dilemma series videos and episodes are meant for one goal, and that is to mitigate those risks. Even when you're setting up a high availability solution for your SQL Server databases, the goal is to identify those risks, in this case potential downtime, potential data loss, and then mitigating those risks by implementing a high availability solution. But that doesn't mean the risk mitigation stops there, or the risk analysis stops there. It continues as the implementation evolves from proof of concept to deploying it in production, cutting over to production, and then day-to-day operation. You have to constantly analyze what those risks are and properly mitigate those risks. That's not something that your vendor would do for free. They would charge you for that. But again, it's something that you really have to consider when it comes to some of these vendor recommendations. Again, this is part two. I don't want to say part two, but it's part of a vendor dilemma series that I've started last week, talking about some of the vendor recommendations when it comes to high availability and or disaster recovery solutions for your SQL Server databases. Because again, at the end of the day, it will be your databases, it will be your career on the line, not theirs. Okay? Tune in again for next week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And if you had experiences working with vendors where they would flat out recommend, hey, implement always on availability groups. I would love to hear about those experiences. Put them in the comments below. And I'm pretty sure they're somehow similar to some of the experiences that I've had. And if you do need help with anything related to your SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, maybe you're in the process of evaluating what solution would be appropriate for your business requirements. Okay, good enough that would meet your business requirements, and that you have, if you're taking ownership and accountability for care and feeding, the implementation, or just understanding what the risks are with implementing such a high availability solution, reach out. Use that link on the screen. Okay, schedule a strategy session and let's have conversation. This will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you, the date and time that works for you. How we go about the strategy session is we'll do two things. One, we'll get clear on what your business requirements are. Somebody actually commented on one of the episodes for somebody who helps customers with always on availability groups. You seem like the kind of person who doesn't like always on availability groups. Well, that's not really the case. It's just that I'm more concerned about your business requirements rather than just implementing always on availability groups. I don't need more experience implementing the solution. I've done hundreds, I mean close to 1,000 at this point. I've done so many of those. I'm more concerned about making sure that a specific high availability solution is right for your business needs. Okay, and part of getting clear is also making sure that you have the right strategy to implement once you're clear on your requirements. So use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and be happy to help you in any way I can. All right. And that's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you again next time. Bye.